So I should begin by telling you, you'll see our chemistry like Lady Gaga and Bradley Moore had, because I had the fortune when I was at MIT with Ernie and John Deutsch and 5 or 6 other faculty of putting the MIT Energy Initiative together, which Secretary Moniz, who I will call Ernie for the rest of the discussion, led brilliantly and really defined academics what we should be doing in energy. I think this week you heard you're all in trouble. And scientists are good at telling you you're in trouble, but you need to have solutions. That always makes people happier. And today what I think we would like to talk about is you have to have 2 things working in concert to have a solution. You need to have both discovery and technology solutions, but then without a path forward with policy and proper policy, it doesn't translate. It's not going to translate quickly enough. So what I'll do is lead off with some science discoveries about a low-carbon future. And it gets to this photosynthesis idea. Actually, we should give photosynthesis a break. You know what? It's very, very energy efficient. It just like you, though, it doesn't want to get fat on its food, which is the sun. So it doesn't store the energy, but it uses it very efficiently. And so a few years ago, we decided to take photosynthesis and offload all the energy that it needs to live and direct it to saving it. And what we did is this idea called the artificial leaf. So when you give plants water, they actually, when you're watering the plant, guess what? When the sunlight hits the leaf, it splits water to hydrogen and oxygen. So it just rearranges the bonds of water to hydrogen and oxygen. And then at night, it breathes in carbon dioxide, and it makes biomass. And so a few years ago, what we did is we figured out a way to take silicon, and I'm a chemist. We made special catalysts. So when light hits your solar panel on your roof, you get a current, and then that current you use in your house. But when the sun goes down, of course, you can't use it. So what we did is we didn't use wires. When we made that current, that moving charge, it energized these catalysts, and it split water to oxygen and hydrogen. And we were able to do that at 14%. That means energy in to the amount of hydrogen. Now, the problem is, and Ernie was involved a little bit with this because he was director of the MIT Energy Initiative. Mr. Tata of India was very excited about this and drove this forward to a technology. But then you run into this problem. If I gave you hydrogen right now, what would you do with it? You would blow up balloons. And so then you start running into these issues, which Ernie will go into. You make a discovery that's too far from an infrastructure and is very hard to translate. And so a few years ago, what we did is there's this new science called synthetic biology. It's kind of an old science, but it's been revolutionized because we know the genome of all these wonderful organisms now. And so we were able to take bacteria and feed the hydrogen to them and have them breathe carbon dioxide in and then actually make liquid fuels. And 2 years ago, we beat out photosynthesis by a factor of 10. So our biomass now grows 10 times faster than other biomass. And then, in another iteration, we told the bacteria, use the hydrogen and then take nitrogen and make fertilizer. And you can literally put the bacteria in the ground. This has all happened in the last year. And you can grow crops at 300% crop yields for the poor. And so these discoveries, they're wonderful discoveries, but then you need to translate and you need to move forward. And I'll give one policy structure for the poor, because a lot of your energy needs in the future are going to be for the poor. And then Ernie's going to talk about this part of the world, the developed world. You almost have to be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde when you think about energy. So there's going to be 3 billion people born in the next 30 years, and they're being born in the poor parts of the world. They need a lot of energy, driving energy. And then we have the developed world, and there's two big differences. The developed world, I'm doing calculations with some Chicago economists right now. We spent $17 trillion on our infrastructure, immediate fossil fuel infrastructure, over 100 years. So who's going to walk away from a $17 trillion paid-off investment? So it's not really the oil companies are being mean and trying to find Ernie and I and get rid of us. It's very hard for you to walk away from a paid-off infrastructure, but the poor don't have that issue. They're looking at a future. So what we're doing, just to move this discovery forward, and now you'll see the need for policy. A friend of Ernie's and mine, Michael Greenstone, and a famous economist at Harvard, Rahini Pandey in India, we have little helium neon lasers in every 10,000 smokestacks in India. We can see particulate emission, and they've set up an emission trading scheme to generate revenue, which I have going to the Institute of Chemical Technology. At MIT, there used to be lots of engineers. At Harvard, there aren't so many, so I had to go to India and find some chem engineers. And what we're doing is, from that ETS trading scheme, I don't need investment dollars. It's hard to get investors to invest in the poor because you can't get an ROI, return on investment. So with the money being generated from this trading scheme, which the Indian government has agreed to because of the stature of Rahini Pandey and Michael Greenstone, we're able to fund ICT, and now they're scaling up these discoveries to feed the poor and give energy to the poor in a distributed way within the next 2 years. So that's one model where you see the integration and need for policy with technology. And that's in the developing world. Ernie has been a leader for the developed world, setting policies, especially for our country. And so in terms of decarbonizing a future, I'm going to let Ernie tell you about the sorts of things you need to confront in this world, this country, this developed infrastructure.
Now?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, all right. All right, well, thanks, Dan, and we'll have a chance to have more exchanges, as we have had for many years. Let me first start by noting the unfortunate state of much of the discussion we have today in terms of addressing the solutions to the issue. First of all, in the political realm, we have what I would call magical thinking at both ends of the political spectrum, and neither is helpful. What I mean by that is, and of course calling it the political spectrum is a very crude concept, but let's just use that on the far right, where we see some rather impoverished discussions about denial of the fact that we are influencing the climate, warming the globe, and need to take action. But on the, let's call it the far left, we also see put forward completely impractical, impossible to implement ideas. You know, no carbon in 5 years or 10 years, something like that. This does not help move us forward. As I say, I think that's equally magical thinking. Now, that is often associated with what's called the Green New Deal, but I want to clarify that. Now, it is unfortunate that around the Green New Deal were put forward some of these magical ideas. But I'm going to say that in terms of energy and climate, the core of the Green New Deal are two principles that must be pursued simultaneously. One is fairly obvious, low carbon. But what has taken a much lower, has a much lower profile in the debate, and is the second pillar of that Green New Deal, is that in pursuing low carbon, it is done with social equity in the foreground. Now, that may sound very abstract, but just to make it very concrete, let's take the example of a policy response through a price on CO2 emissions, a carbon tax. Fine, that addresses the low carbon part. What about the social equity part? That is entwined with what are you going to do with the money? And let's just say we're talking $50 a ton. Just to remind you, in the United States, that would be $300 billion a year. This is not spare change. Now, let's take two extremes. One, suppose that $300 billion is taken as a down payment against our $1 trillion annual deficit. That is a completely regressive approach. You can ask Mr. Macron about such a policy. You could call it pejoratively paying for tax cuts for the rich. Let's take another extreme, that which is proposed by former Republican secretaries of state, George Shultz, Jim Baker, others, Hank Paulson, etc., which is a uniform dividend to everyone from that entire pot of money. It's kind of intuitively obvious, but if you go through some pretty simple modeling, what you conclude is roughly the lower 70%, 70, of the income distribution comes out ahead, a progressive use of the money. So that's just one example to illustrate what it means that you do the low carbon, but you do it in a way that advances social equity as well. Second point, to avoid these poles of magical thinking, what a colleague and I put forward a couple of months ago, we called it the Green Real Deal. That is, once you have the Green New Deal principles, now the question is, what's the program? And I'll be coming to, again, exemplifying that. So what our argument is, if we are going to move forward on low carbon as fast as we can, even if we would like to move as fast as we need, it doesn't matter if you can't actually do it. And this is not popular at some of the polls of this discussion, but our argument is, if we cannot forge a pretty broad-based political coalition, which includes the incumbent energy companies as well as the disruptors, and we can go on, then we're not going to move forward as fast as we can. Again, to exemplify some of the tensions there, I will just refer to something that actually President Obama discussed on the South Lawn of the White House in October of 2016, shortly before the election, in a staged dialogue, something like this, with Leonardo DiCaprio. And President Obama showed exactly the kind of pragmatic approach that I think is absolutely critical. He made a couple of points. One is the one we've already alluded to in Mr. Macron's policy, for example, when the president said, now, I have this dad, I imagine, somewhere in the middle of the country who has to drive 50 miles each way to work to barely meet the family budget. And of course, we know a lot of people have to drive a long way to work because, frankly, they can't afford to live in the places where many of the jobs are. And Obama says, now let me understand. You want me to tell him how bad it's going to be in 50 years? Second thing he said, and he started out by saying, I know this is not going to be popular with this audience. Fracking. Now, we have an industry that is booming, huge number of jobs, including manufacturing jobs, and responsible for 60% of this country's CO2 reductions. Give me a break. It's got problems with environmental footprint. We got to work on those, but we cannot ignore all of these other issues. That's the kind of thinking that, at least for the relatively near term, needs to be advanced.
And Ernie, for that one, it's interesting because what you do with fracking is you get the hydrogen out. And I just told you I have an invention to make hydrogen from the sun, but no infrastructure. So in fracking, by having the hydrogen come from natural gas, that starts to put a path to install an infrastructure. That then when you want to get rid of the carbon, you start looking at these new discoveries.
Yeah. And I'll come back to that, Dan.
Yeah.
That's a very important point. It's all about the steps that one takes to have breakthrough innovations come in and ultimately solve things. So that was the second point I wanted to make. Third, let me finally give a concrete example about the movement to low carbon over these next years and decades. And I'm going to draw upon an extensive study that some colleagues and I have done, and this will be posted in a week or so. We're tidying up the report. But it was a report on specifically looking at California's pathways to meet its low carbon goals. And California, as is usual, is kind of out in front with the policy proposals and the like. So in a nutshell, I think the way to think about this is, and it's the way that California and others, including the Paris Agreement, have kind of structured the objectives. Typically, there is an objective for, let's call it the 2030 timeframe. In California, I would say the main policy, legislated policy goal is a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 in 2030. And then secondly, there tends to be a goal for mid-century. In the Paris Agreement, it's the usual 80 by 50, so-called, 80% reduction by 2050. There are more aggressive goals today, like especially because of some of the recent climate reports and the urgent and the even heightened sense of urgency that one would aim for carbon net neutrality by 2050, but it doesn't matter in detail for our purposes, but there are those two kinds of goals. Following up some of what Dan said, the way to think about this in our view is, first of all, for 2030, it's really about blocking and tackling and hard work, given the technologies that we see in front of us, sure, with increased let's call it incremental innovation and cost reduction, but frankly, in a decade, we cannot expect any kind of new breakthrough technology to have been deployed at any sufficient scale to move the needle, although we need to work on those breakthrough technologies today if we are going to have them available, let's say, in the mid-century timeframe. And frankly, we would turn around the statement relative to 2030 for mid-century, namely, we cannot meet the objectives that we have talked about without breakthrough innovations and technology. Perhaps what Dan has discussed, or a number of others that we can address. So just to be again more specific and end this kind of overview. So if we looked at 2030 for California and its pathways, several points to make. One is that we all love to talk about electricity decarbonization. We like to talk about it because it's the easiest sector to decarbonize. And it also merits a focus because electrification in other sectors holds considerable promise. However, and admittedly, now California is anomalous, but let's talk about numbers. Numbers are inconvenient. The emissions in California from electricity are 16%. 39% from transportation. 23% from industry. Then you have buildings, and you have these little inconvenient sectors like agriculture, producing food, which are awkward to decarbonize. So the point is, if we do not focus more and more on these hard to decarbonize sectors, once again, we will be doing magical thinking and not actually addressing real solutions. So in transportation, again, we mentioned electrification, and it's obvious. Battery vehicles, electric vehicles are part of the solution. But when we look bottom up, and we looked at 31 different technology pathways to 2030, and what could be what we would see as credible stretch, but credible carbon reduction opportunities, what we find is, let's say in transportation, sure, getting to California's goal of 5 million electric vehicles by 2030 is important, but not as important as continuing to increase the energy efficiency of vehicles. Getting to meet California's low carbon fuel standard is important, but not as important as energy efficiency in vehicles. But I've already mentioned 3 different pathways for light-duty vehicles, and you've got to do them all. In fact, our message, and I won't go into any more detail on it, but our message is when we look at all of these pathways, and we've got lots of bar charts with all the sectors and what you can do in each of these sectors, the good news is, our conclusion is, you can do it. You can meet these goals. It does not violate the laws of physics. However, you pretty much have to hit a home run for every technology pathway to get there. And number 2, if you start injecting your favorites, like electricity should be all wind and solar, for example, a favorite listing of favorites, boy, you make your life really hard. And I mean in multiple ways. Reliability of the system, the enormous stress that you will put on developing storage solutions, but also eliminating things like advanced nuclear technologies, eliminating directions like carbon capture and sequestration really limits you. Indeed, what we found in California is if they really started today to be serious about deployment of carbon capture and sequestration, even on the limited number of power plants that are amenable to this technology, that one pathway could account for the order of 1/3 of the emissions reductions. And yet, it is nowhere, frankly, it is ideologically disfavored by many. So again, our view is we've got to be pragmatic, we've got to be open. And by the way, I should have added the obvious, that if you admit carbon capture and sequestration as one of the options, boy, does that help in that coalition building in terms of bringing in other parties. So that gives you a flavor of kind of meeting through technology pathways these kinds of intermediate goals. Let me just say a word about the mid-century goals, and then the need for these breakthrough innovations. And I'll just use one example. Again, let's talk about the world in which, and California is the leader in deployment, especially of solar energy. It's quite substantial already, and creating substantial problems for the system, frankly, in terms of the system operation. But let's think about, imagine that future where solar is, let's say, dominant source of electricity generation in the mid-century. You know, I think even in the denial part of the spectrum, you would find very little objection to the statement that the sun produces more in the day than at night. And there would be a need for, you know, battery storage and the like to manage that. However, even though it's equally obvious, really, but never focused on, at our latitudes, the sun produces more than double the amount in the summer than in the winter. That's a reminder that if you want to get a system that works in this way, it's not only the 4-hour storage of a lithium-ion battery. With some apologies to Dan, it's important, but it's not enough to talk about the several days that one might get from flow batteries or pumped hydro, other things. What about the seasonal storage you would need in that case? Today, there is no solution, but I'll end by going back to what Dan said. Okay, one example is you could use that, quotes, excess generation to make hydrogen. You will need a fuel in the mix. Hydrogen could be that. The trouble is today, as Dan said, or implied at least, it's very expensive to do it through electrolysis. But today, we can make hydrogen. We do make hydrogen from natural gas steam reforming, but it emits CO2. We could do that with carbon capture and sequestration. That could be a pathway to a low-carbon future where we do, in fact, manage to greatly reduce the capital costs of electrolysis, or we have radically new solutions like the one that Dan is talking about. So thinking about this in a system way, multiple pathways forward, that's an example of how one could actually bring all of this together to get there. But if we sit here today and claim that we have any clue what the essentially deeply decarbonized system of 2050 looks like, we're nuts. And we got to avoid these kinds of magical solutions that people are putting forward too often, and in this case, really focus on the key word, scientific and technical innovation. That is the solution, actually, for deeply decarbonization. We should know by now to bet much more on the fruits of innovation than on the results of predetermined outcomes in this kind of a time frame. So that's kind of where we're thinking about it, and how we think that the deeply decarbonized future can actually emerge. With that?
Yeah, and just to close, and because we want to leave more time for you to ask questions, there are other parts of the world that are moving very quickly. So I've been working with Jacinda Ardern's administration in New Zealand, and they're doing exactly what Ernie says. First, they have it a lot easier than us because they have a big hydroelectric base, and it's a long, skinny country, so that helps. But they're going to she's been working with me and her administration to go to a deep hydrogen economy where they view themselves as being hydrogen exporters in the next 10 years. So there are places around the world that have it easier than, say, the United States, which is big, and there's the middle that's not near water, for instance. But there'll be examples. And one bad side, the bad side is the United States has lost its voice in energy in a global way in many different forums. On a good side, it's like having graduate students. When you'd think, what's going to happen when this graduate student leaves? We're in trouble. And then all these other graduate students, like flowers, start sprouting up. And I'm starting to see that worldwide. Countries that didn't really have a voice, because the United States had such a large one and needs to keep having a large one. But I'm starting to see lots of other innovation coming from countries that they're the sprouting flowers. So with that, we want to leave all the rest of this time for as long as Annie wants us to go for questions.
Are you the traffic cop in terms of?
Yeah, I'll be traffic cop.
All right.
Or you want to be traffic
Can I
cop?
ask one question
Sure.
first? And that is, you haven't talked at all about methane reduction in the atmosphere. I had understood that that's low-hanging fruit that you might be able to harvest early. I wonder if you could comment about that.
Sure. First of all, there are a number of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions that present considerable opportunity. But I do want to emphasize that one reason for the CO2 focus is that the CO2 residence time is so much longer in the atmosphere that it is cumulative. Basically, a CO2 molecule emitted anywhere, kind of roughly speaking, any time, is part of the cumulative load in the atmosphere, whereas the other greenhouse gases tend to have much shorter residence times. Now, methane is one example, and there are many opportunities for methane reduction in the whole, especially the natural gas supply chain and leaks, et cetera. That is happening, but a lot more could happen. But let me mention another one, if I may, and that's the HFCs. Just before the Paris Agreement, there was reached agreement in Kigali on a amendment to the Montreal Protocol. If you remember with the Montreal Protocol for air conditioning, let's say, the CFCs were the magic answer to protect the ozone hole, and that was a good answer for ozone. It was a terrible answer, it turns out, for climate change. And now HFCs HFCs came in, excuse me, so now we need other substitutions. To give you an idea of the stakes, the projections with an enormous increase in air conditioning, especially in the tropics, we're talking about a 0.5 degree centigrade just from solving that problem.
Oh my.
So there are huge opportunities with these other greenhouse gases. Yeah.
Annie, where?
Yeah, we'll come here and then following more, we'll wait again.
Okay.
Jim Baker from Washington, D.C. What do you see as the role of energy efficiency in meeting a low-carbon future?
You want to answer?
Well, I'll give a simple answer, and Ernie can give a more complicated one. You can calculate your energy in the future pretty easily. You only need to know 3 numbers: population, GDP per capita, and then energy intensity. How much energy do you need to hit a GDP? And that's conservation. And the way you can think about it now is you have the world's burning a 19 trillion watt light bulb. It means it's on all the time, and you got to give it energy to keep the 19 trillion watt light bulb on. When you do the calculation with increasing population, and then you use a global average of 2.3% GDP per capita growth, which has been the number that the world's been on for many, many, many years. If I make the assumption that you save every bit of energy you use today, you still need 16 terawatts more of energy. So it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition.
What I would just add is that, particularly if I go back to that framework I described that we used in the California study, and we plan to adopt for other regional studies as well, what always comes out is, certainly in the 2030 timeframe, efficiency is the longest pole in the tent, because it's something that you can realize across all of those sectors, including the hard-to-decarbonize sectors. But I'll make another point. Our goal is low carbon. If one has reached a stage where, let's say, electricity production has been decarbonized, then efficiency in the use of electricity is not a relevant issue for carbon emissions. So these things kind of play off, and a lot of things will look different for a 2050 solution than for a 2030 solution, again, assuming that we have these breakthrough innovations that I'm certainly counting on.
Yeah. Mary Claire King from Seattle. Could you give us your analysis of whether these goals are accomplishable by putting together a large number of regional, either state, local, possibly slightly larger region efforts, in case we are confronted with the absence of national vision for a long period?
Let me start answering that by going back to June 1st, 2017, when President Trump announced withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. A withdrawal, by the way, that, in case you don't know, will not be effective until the day after the next presidential election. So we have obvious hope here. But I think what was interesting is, and very encouraging, is that almost immediately what you had were governors, mayors, including the mayors of very large cities in the states without renewable portfolio standards, and more than 1,000 people from industry coming forward and saying, well, okay, that's interesting, Mr. President, but we're staying the course. Because, frankly, just about everybody really knows that we are heading to a low-carbon future. There may be a few bumps in the road. There may be a few 4-year issues of, mixed messages. But we're not going to make large capital allocations on the basis of a high-carbon future. So from that point of view, I'm optimistic. And certainly the states have been leaders. We have 29 states with renewable portfolio standards, for example. Not the most economically efficient way to go about the business, but nevertheless with effect. And an additional 7 states with various kinds of restrictions. And that's very important. But obviously, we're not going to get there in the end without national leadership. And very important, although it may sound cynical, but the announcement of Paris withdrawal really has, I could argue, has very little impact, because domestically it doesn't show that much happens. And frankly, we wouldn't have been exercising international leadership anyway in this administration. That's what's missing, and that is a real consequence. China, for example, has tried to step forward. It doesn't work somehow. I mean, they're doing a lot internally, China, that's another discussion, but in terms of, the world is not yet bluntly ready to follow that, even though, in my view, the seminal action that led to what I consider to be success in Paris was the joint Obama-Xi press conference a year earlier. That's what told the world, something can come of this, right? So anyway, we're going to have to get back to not just national leadership for our internal program, but we're going to have to get back to exerting international leadership. I fear if that goes too long, it will take a long time to reestablish.
Bob Tarjan, Princeton. You said hydrogen production and also converting hydrogen into hydrocarbon fuels. I wonder if you can say anything about the realism of fuel cells versus hydrocarbons and how we get the infrastructure we might need for hydrogen.
I can't sit down.
Well, so first, I'm on the Hydrogen Technology Advisory Council for this administration, which means they don't listen to us, but the real issue is, and this is where California is a lead again, you can't go to a gas station and find hydrogen. If you could, a lot of this transportation
Of course
problem,
you can. It's attached to carbon.
Yeah, it's attached to carbon.
Right.
By the way, Ernie's bringing up a good point. A fuel is a hydrogen source, and that's why you get rid of the CO2, and that's how nature works. once it splits water to hydrogen and oxygen, when it adds it to CO2, it gets no extra energy. It's just a hydrogen source. So when you're burning that gasoline, you're just basically getting the hydrogen out, the energy from the hydrogen. But the real issue is distribution. All the major car companies, BMW, I've driven in all the cars, they have a huge fleet ready to go. But there's no way to get distribution. And so California's trying. I just see this to be a really long road. You can't put hydrogen into like our natural gas infrastructure easily, use that. But that's where, like I was saying, for somebody like New Zealand, it's a much easier problem, and that's why I'm working over there right now. But I don't know, what do you think about the near-term infrastructure for hydrogen?
Well, the infrastructure issue is huge, but
Yeah.
let me say that personally, I think it's hard to see the pathway where the fuel cell / hydrogen solution is preferred to a battery solution for light-duty vehicles. But I think as you go to, we love to talk about the things that we kind of know and work, as opposed to the awkward issue that there are many, many other parts of the transportation system that are probably far less amenable to the battery solution. The fuel cell solution could look much more attractive. And certainly for some, there's a lot of work going on, with electric airplanes right now. I would put, if I had to make a bet, I would put more on the issue of how do we make low-carbon hydrocarbon fuels, low-carbon hydrocarbon fuels, like the thing that Dan is doing. It could be also, there are advanced biofuel possibilities there. So I think the point is infrastructure, the nature of the challenge are really present very, very different options, and we're going to need all of these technologies in various ways. Now, on the hydrogen infrastructure, I think there's a lot of people who just kind of automatically think, let's take the extreme, Dan mentioned it, let's put hydrogen into natural gas pipes. Well, I think there's a lot of problems with that. And by the way, at least I'm probably less interested in having those come to my cooking range, the hydrogen directly, than other solutions. But there are many other ways of approaching this, including it may be that the main way of moving hydrogen around is by attaching it to some other molecule and then releasing it at the end use. So I think there's all of these options, and that's what we. By the way, let me, as an aside, some of you may have read that in the Senate right now, particularly led by Lamar Alexander, who is liberated in his last 2 years in the Senate, there is a growing move to try to double the clean energy innovation budget. And leave the word climate out, and it doesn't raise the hackles. And so we'll see if that works. But frankly, that is what's needed. And that's been something that's been stated for a decade in many ways. And if you do that, I think you can open up many, many more pathways to this future. One is, in my group, by the way, we'll have another report coming out probably in June on something called carbon direct removal. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up things here, but if we go back to that tough set of goals for mid-century, especially if you think about net carbon neutrality, that's pretty tough. I personally don't believe we can do it without carbon direct removal solutions. Now, that could include major enhanced biological sequestration, let's call it natural or synthetic biology type solutions to modifying certain kinds of biomass. It could include new kinds of what I would call geological sequestration, like weathering of certain formations, enhanced weathering. It could involve very, very deep isolation in saline aquifers. It could involve, even better, something that Dan would be talking about, which is large-scale utilization of carbon dioxide in commodity products. And there's no better commodity product than fuels, than fuels in the end. You know, there's cement, there are other possibilities. So these are the kinds of innovation pathways, and I just think there are far more options, even for something like hydrogen infrastructure, than people are thinking about.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you, the biomass I'm growing now is growing 10 times faster than nature. That means I'm fixing carbon 10 times faster than nature. And the DOE has now joined forces with USDA because they're seeing the power that an agricultural platform can provide for carbon removal.
Well, one of the problems is that when you take these kinds of novel approaches, by the way, the most straightforward carbon direct removal conceptually is direct air capture, capturing the carbon dioxide out of the air. At $1,000 a ton, it's a real bargain. But one of the structural issues is, whether it's within the Department of Energy or within the government as a whole, you really cannot find the natural home for these carbon direct removal approaches. Certainly the DOE, the agriculture, NOAA are all big players. I mean, there could be others, but those are big players. But again, even within the Department of Energy, there's no real home for a lot of these technologies. So probably don't want to get into chasing down that rabbit hole. But there may be big organizational challenges to meet, and those will probably be more difficult than the science that Dan's talking about.
Martin Rees, Cambridge. Just an international question. Do you think it would ever be feasible to have a sort of global grid, a DC grid carrying energy from the sunny south up north and east-west to smooth over peak demand in different time zones, maybe even all the way from Europe to China on the Belt and Road?
So now we get to real cost issues. That could happen, but you then look at the infrastructure cost, and all of a sudden, all the things that I'm doing that are too expensive aren't that expensive anymore. And so, you know, what science does is always, you can't make decisions for you, but I can give you options. That's all science can do, and then you hopefully choose those options. And a way I think about it is, if you went back 100 years ago and look at the amount of money you've spent for your grid and current existing infrastructure, all the things we're talking about right now are way cheaper if they existed then. So I haven't done the full cost analysis, but my gut feeling is you might have better options in distributed systems where large infrastructures haven't been built yet. But there are certainly advocates, I should tell you, for DC grids from Sahara to Europe and all over the world. But this is an enormous cost to build that infrastructure.
Yeah, I actually reached the same conclusion as Dan, although I'm not quite as pessimistic. As long as, frankly, I wouldn't talk about global grid as opposed to a number of interesting regional multinational solutions. The Sahara to Southern Europe is certainly one example, but let me go closer to home. In the United States, the enormous wind resource in the middle of the country where there's very little load, mainly because people don't like to walk at an angle to the wind all the time. Moving that wind to the big load centers has proved to be extremely difficult, and not only because of cost. I'll just say one anecdote.
Ernie, you must have done the calculation at DOE. What would be a DC grid?
So let me
Yeah.
let me focus on something. It's not cost.
Okay.
But in 2007, the Congress, in its wisdom, passed a law. It had a lot of certain restrictions, but which I won't bother you with. But fundamentally, it gave the Department of Energy some powers of eminent domain for high voltage connections from here to there to move renewables.
Yeah.
And I can assure you, sitting in a position of political responsibility, there's nothing you like better than the chance to use eminent domain. It's really fantastic. So we
become everybody's friend.
That's right. It's so we chose very carefully, but finally a project came available that could not have been a better poster child for what Congress's intent was. Namely, it would be a high voltage line bringing western Oklahoma wind, ample resource, to the southeast through a connection into Tennessee. There was one inconvenience. It was called Arkansas. And so we said, look, let's just say we were very thoughtful and slow until the company agreed to build a drop in Arkansas, until they agreed to source the supply chain in Arkansas. Yeah. Did all kinds of things for Arkansas. And then I approved it. It was a week before we were in court. And then 2 years later, the federal court ruled that for the government, because it was cut and dried. I mean, it satisfied all of the legal requirements, and then it took a few months before political and market power killed the project after it was approved. So that just tells you that there are a lot of issues. Cost, it may be one,
yeah,
but even when there is clearly a cost benefit, as in this case, it was a commercial, there was no subsidy, purely commercial, made sense. There's so much resistance that the more distributed approach really brings lots and lots of advantages with it.
Jane Schenmiller from UCLA. Your discussion is important about a magical solution, scientific innovation, but do the scientists work with some social scientists about conservation? Our country is the most wasteful nation in the world. Yeah. If we keep on wasting, all the solution may not come to fruition.
Yeah. This is a social science I work with. I do. Actually, I've worked with the Divinity School because I want to understand how the poor do adoption, and it turns out religion is a good pathway forward. So I'm agreeing with you. To understand social cultures, it's very important to move these new technologies. So I'll go back to that kind of boring equation I told you. It was N, which is population, GDP per capita, energy intensity. N is social science, GDP per capita is economics and policy, and energy intensity is policy and business, and then energy intensity is science and technology. And so if you don't have that product of social science times business and political science times technology, it's not going to work. Even this issue that Ernest's talking about is a line going through with eminent domain. That's really a social issue, and there's probably huge problems there that would benefit from social science. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and I just reinforced again, just A to agree. Yeah, exactly.
I totally agree with conservation, but the sad thing is the huge energy need we have coming from the poorer parts of the world. You have to conserve, and it's still not enough. I just don't want to make you think you can conserve your way out of this problem. You have to do it. You have to do it, because then the energy need is going to be even more massive.
Yeah, and by the way, I'd say, let's say in the United States, but clearly in Europe, more in the developed world at the moment, perhaps, but it took a long time, but we have made a lot of progress in things like recycling, et cetera, and we just have to have the same kind of campaign and success and, frankly, long-term view to have the kind of behavioral change that can certainly help the solutions. Dan may want to supplement it with prayer, apparently, but I think hard work would probably be more called for.
David Tatel, Washington, D.C. First of all, your conversation this morning has been fascinating, so thank you for that. I have two unrelated questions. Number one, I'd be really interested to hear you talk for a minute or two about the role of nuclear in the future, and particularly questions of safety and also disposal. Where are we on that? And the unrelated question is, I'd also be curious to hear what you think about the various ideas for geoengineering. Are these just ridiculous, or are there some geoengineering ideas that are worth pursuing?
Well, let me certainly take on the first one. If Dan, maybe you want to comment on the second one.
Yeah.
On nuclear, the first statement is that there has never in the history of nuclear energy been as much innovation going on as there is today. There's probably more than 40 companies in the United States, and I might say both in nuclear fission and nuclear fusion, pursuing novel concepts. Another discussion, but an important one, is that it's an expensive business to actually move any of them to the let's say major demonstration phase, and so there's a common issue to be resolved in terms of how you get the financial engineering there. But in terms of the technologies, starting with fission, that a number of non-light water reactor technologies, very attractive in terms of safety possibilities. I think what's clearly, until there's a real demonstration, we cannot really say what the cost per installed megawatt will be, but there are reasons to think that despite going to a smaller scale of these new reactors, I would say typically we're talking in the 50 to 200 megawatt range as opposed to the gigawatt plus range, that there are many opportunities for cost reduction, including the possibility of bringing to bear all of the quality assurance and trained workforce opportunities that you would have in producing and having a production line that kind of cranks out a whole bunch of the same kind of module, entire nuclear module, that you can then put on a truck or a train or a barge and take to a site. That remains to be proved, but very, I think very encouraging at its core. But let me say that there is often confusion caused that some of these technologies also magically remove the nuclear waste challenge. It's not correct. That, you know, if you tell me how many kilowatt hours you produced in nuclear, within a very good approximation, I'll tell you how many fission products you made, and that dominates the nuclear waste issue, certainly century timescale, and so for that we still need the disposal solutions. I am actually rather optimistic that we may see, this will sound very Pollyannish, but we may see progress on this in this Congress. And that progress is not on the geological disposal end, but on the intermediate consolidated storage. That is, to be able to move to licensing, especially in Texas, a facility that would allow spent fuel to be sent there in storage until geological isolation follows. And if you think about it from the utility perspective, they care much more about getting the stuff moved away somewhere than about actually putting it into a hole in the ground. So I think we'll see progress there. Frankly, I know that when I was secretary in a little spurt of good governance, we worked across the aisle, 4 leading senators, and we wrote a bill for storage that passed the Senate. It was blocked by one person, really, in the House of Representatives from going forward. Leadership of the House has flipped, obviously. I think there's an interesting possibility there. But I will say, and it's obviously still challenging, and for Truth in Advertising, I'm involved in one of these directions, but in the fusion world, that's where, of course, you could have nuclear with essentially a solution to the nuclear waste problem, the back end problem. So, so again, these are the kinds of breakthrough innovations that I think we need to support and to move forward, and we only need a few of them to work out to make a huge impact.
And for the geoengineering, I mean, we are doing geoengineering for carbon capture. I mean, that's going on, and actually the leads are...
Can I just say, we are doing geoengineering by emitting all this carbon dioxide.
Right. Yeah, we're also doing that geoengineering.
Right.
And by the way, the oil companies are taking the lead in that because they know in case carbon pricing comes down the road, they better be somewhat prepared. But there are all these other geoengineering, and that's where I end up becoming a conservative. So I think you should do small-scale experiments where you spray particles in the air and reflect. In case, if there's something catastrophic that starts happening, you might want to be prepared. But in general, I'm always hesitant to do super large-scale experiments on our environment. That scares me. And we've done those in the past. We've done it with algae blooms, and we've killed huge parts of the ocean with unbelievable consequences. So I tend to be a conservative. There are other people who aren't, especially engineers. You can do smaller scale experiments and probably want to do them to have in your back pocket in case something catastrophically happens.
I just mentioned one footnote to that, and that is that if you take the most commonly discussed geoengineering is exactly this aerosol emissions to have more reflection of sunlight and lowering of temperature. Some argue that, yeah, we need this in our back pocket in case lowering the temperature for a few years is absolutely required despite collateral damage. Because, for example, if you imagine this kind of solar reflection technique, yeah, presumably you could get some lowering of temperature. But as you keep emitting CO2, for example, you would keep contributing to ocean acidification. So there are all kinds of unintended consequences in a certain sense in terms of geoengineering. There's also it's a fine line between what I called carbon direct removal and geoengineering in some cases. For example, if we had engineered plants, grasses that fix dramatically larger amounts of CO2, is that geoengineering? It certainly is carbon direct removal. That would be geoengineering, we think, without some of those collateral consequences.
Okay, Jessica Matthews from Washington, D.C. Ernie, I may have misheard you, but it seemed you were a little bit lukewarm about carbon pricing. I would argue that the only answer to this is a fully refundable carbon tax fee on a per capita basis, implemented with enough discipline that all that money is returned. Because as soon as you crack the door open, what always happens, and with this big a pot of money, is that Congress will start to fight about who gets what. Coal miners, DOE's R&D budget, who knows, and eventually the coalition for passage falls apart. But a serious per capita, per ton, carbon per ton fee returned on a per capita basis, even to Bill Gates, I mean, there are few enough of him, solves your problem about people who have predetermined answers to R&D, solves Dan's problem, who even with an inadequate R&D budget can still produce more innovation than the market can commercialize. Why is this not the answer that everybody who agonizes on this problem is not pushing actively?
So Jessica, first of all, I think if I sounded lukewarm on it, didn't intend to, because I said actually the price plus the dividend approach is progressive, so it answers both of my pillars of low carbon and being progressive. So if you ask me about all the various proposals out there now, I would probably put at the head of the line the Schultz-Baker proposal in terms of the dividend. However, a couple of caveats. The Schultz-Baker proposal has got 4 pillars, not 2. It's got the price and it's got the dividend. Pillar number 3, reduced and removed regulation and incentives. I don't object in principle to that, but show me what you mean. I'll give you an example. If we still had the Clean Power Plan, which was effectively going to accelerate the reduction of coal in electricity generation, would I trade that for the price? Absolutely. But would I trade the Supreme Court ruling that CO2 can be regulated under the Clean Air Act? No. Because that's a permanent regulation, if you like, that bounds this as opposed to having a little bait and switch. So how that is done is a critical issue never defined. 4th pillar, carbon border adjustments. What do you do? Okay, let's say the United States adopts the $50 price, et cetera, but our neighbors and other countries don't. There is obviously a, quote, level playing field issue with manufacturing, et cetera. So the proposal is that there's some adjustment on carbon adjustment on imports from countries that don't have similar policies. Once again, the problem is nobody has got a clue how to do that. So I'm very favorable to the core of price plus dividend, but I'm saying even there's major issues. Secondly, another major issue is if you take any price that is conceivable, and many think $40 or $50 as is proposed by Schultz and Baker et al., many think that's not politically viable today, at least, that they talk $20, et cetera. Such prices, again, I'm not arguing not to do it, but we have to do it with eyes wide open, that such prices are very uneven in their effect on different sectors. It would provide, for example, a significant additional impetus for going from coal to gas and renewables. But let's remember, a $20, let's say a $20 a ton, or a $40 a ton carbon price is a 40-cent per gallon gasoline tax. It's not clear that that is sufficient to greatly move the needle in the transportation sector. But second, going back to the earlier things, that is part of a regressive nature. Again, I allude to my friend Macron, who, I don't want to say there weren't other factors, but that clearly was a precipitating element for the Gilets jaunes. So anyway, all I'm saying is there's lots of things here to bring together that are not generally put forward in the debate. And there are clearly, again, I still put it at the head of the line of proposals today, but there clearly are other, what you would call regulatory approaches, sector by sector approaches, which you could imagine putting in an effective way.
So this is Eric Horvitz, Seattle area. This is probably out of scope for the expertise of Ernest and Daniel, but I'll say it anyway. When it comes to magical thinking, in quotes, it's really a failure of our ability to address people's focus of attention and understanding of the issues. And it's going to take, when you hear about the histograms in this report about where the sweet spots are, and you see a big discrepancy between what our leading experts think are the sweet spots for effort and innovation versus what the public and politicians and even up-and-coming young scientists think the sweet spots might be. It's a failure to educate, failure to communicate. What might we do to address magical thinking with better education and understanding for different cohorts?
Yeah, it's out of our expertise. I'll tell you what I have seen. In the 60s and 70s, this country believed, I'm going to blame Harvard Business School, that's where I'm headed, by the way. This country believed in science and technology innovation as a way out for lots of mostly political reasons. And then the population believed that. They were educated in it. But because of Harvard Business School, I'm going to pick on them, they taught the United States you don't need to do any of that anymore. You can just become a service-based economy based on trading paper. And I see that in the students I teach now versus when I started my career. And I really think that has, and then social media, without a filter on social media. So this idea of making money off of trading paper is good enough for an economy, and the things that kids are now inundated with, it just makes it a very hard problem. I don't know how to solve it, but I think that's at the root of this, and not the distrust of science, just the absolute ignorance of science. I don't need to worry about it because I can make money someplace else versus the fear of nuclear war from space with Sputnik. So that's just an observation, and then the training of our country and re-education, I don't know how, because I see us diverting from a path that's the one you're trying to address. I think there's probably better experts out there than up here.
Well, there certainly are, but let me just add that I think we're actually making progress. And part of it is Mother Nature is a better educator than we are. And ultimately, climate change will be addressed because of weird weather. But the second note I would offer is, I was like the skunk at the party recently when I was addressing a group that involved parents and their kids by noting that the kids who are skipping school to protest climate inaction, I think are actually having a significant impact and will have more. And I think, having those who are really going to bear the brunt of this, which I would say are the young, and also going back to Dan's theme, unfortunately, the poor are hit first and worst. But I think the young people coming out in this way is having an educational impact.
Yeah. And I'll go one step further, Ernie, with what you're saying. When I started my career, even in the 80s, if I turned to somebody out on the street and said, tell me your view of energy, I would say I would come up 1 out of every 10 people might have some view of energy. Whether I like the view of energy or not, I hear today, I can turn to anybody on the street from any profession and say energy, and they have an opinion on it. And I think that's important. And so it's what Ernie's saying. And I believe that the young children who are growing up with this, I could be a total optimist here, but I believe the problem will go away because they're growing up with it, unlike us who are adapting to it. And I really believe in 30 or 40 years you won't have to have these discussions because that's something they grew with. One other quick thing, I go to the Hill a lot. Of course, Ernie lived there. When you get to climate change, it's really important not to make it a social religious issue, but just a financial issue. So when I talk to some of the most strident Republicans that are anti-climate change, when I rephrase and say it's not your anti-climate change, you're just not worried about it as much as I am, and you don't want to pay for it as much as I do. And it totally starts to change the conversation. And so I think there's ways to express these things where you get to a common base and you're more inclusive.
Let me give another maybe Pollyannish or at least optimistic view, which I hold to be true. First of all, in the political dynamic, there is no doubt that there's much more movement among the Republicans towards acknowledging the issue and acknowledging the need to act. But what I really want to emphasize is, let me give you an analogy. Let me go back to the 1980s and the debate over acid rain. There were many similar, acid rain is a lot easier problem than CO2, but still, the analogy is that you had the same kind of science, anti-science discussions, first of all. Oh, the science hasn't really been demonstrated, et cetera, et cetera. Scientific views just happened to be where you sat in terms of coal plant generation. That was the obvious correlation. And that went back and forth. It was not a partisan issue, it was a regional issue, but it was back and forth. Of course, the science case kept getting stronger and stronger as time went on. And at the same time, in the 1980s, the Department of Energy was putting out the solution tools, demonstrating large-scale scrubbing, for example, from coal plants. And that kind of standoff goes on and on and on, but the science is increasing, the solutions are clearly there. And then what happened at some point, and that point was 1990, those who had been adamantly in the science isn't there camp kind of collectively came to the realization that, we can probably hold off another couple of years. We're going to lose. And then the political reaction is rush to the negotiating table and capture as much rent as you can. And I think we're going to see something similar to that in the climate case. When the solutions start to come, it's going to come fast politically, I think, in this country.
So Annie wants to stop. We need to stop, but okay.
Let's not stop, or these people will get very angry with me. So how about if we have a...
Well, I'm going to get angry with you if we don't. No, but no.
I think Vance is on their side. We have the penultimate question from Andrew Faber, and then the final question of the morning to Sir John Mary Thomas.
Okay.
And then we'll stop. So my question is kind of a near-term political question. I'm concerned that the Democrats, or some of the Democrats, and going forward strongly with the Green New Deal, but if, and this is a question, if they really lack hard-headed evidence to support some near-term solutions, because that's what people want to see, are they in danger, at risk for being mocked and made look ridiculous and endangering the rest of their policies at the same time? So the question is, are there things that they really should be emphasizing in their near-term Green New Deal policy? And do you think, in your opinion, they're actually getting good scientific advice as to what those options should be?
Well, I'll answer this. Ernie may want to add. So first, you should listen to him. So Tom Friedman, this Green Real Deal is from Ernie, which Tom Friedman's been talking about. And that's how they should be moving forward. He will be too modest to say that, but he took that concern, I think, and changed the discussion, and you should read the Friedman article. But Ernie, you can.
All right. Well,
add on.
First of all, I think the Democrats, as you refer to them with the Green New Deal going forward, first of all, I think they are hearing, of course, what I would call the science from the recent reports, the U.S. government report, IPCC report, et cetera, in terms of what the consequences are of not picking up the pace dramatically for lower carbon. The question then comes, what do you do? And that's where our discussion has been. We are trying to do two things. One is, again, to promote this pragmatic view in terms of the solutions, and trying to get those and others to endorse the idea that every arrow in the quiver has got to be usable, not necessarily used, but usable at least, from solar to carbon capture and other things. So I think that's very important. I go back, I won't repeat it, but back to those comments I made that Obama made on the South Lawn. Actually, it's really worth looking up on the internet the transcript of that discussion, Leonardo DiCaprio, October 2016, because frankly, most of the discussion was, and I don't want to sound overly pejorative, although I tend to mean it that way. Most of it was repeating over and over again how bad it's going to be. I know how bad it's going to be. I mean, let's talk about solutions. But those statements by Obama in the middle of that were, I think, very powerful in terms of this pragmatic approach. So I think we need to do that. And we need to be able to increase political accountability next year. Tough assignment. But we got a year and a half to increase political accountability, to make the issue, no matter what you think about it, to make it essentially a voting issue. I think there are some positive signs, not necessarily going as far as we like, but some positive signs going that way, and that's where again I throw in these school truants as an important part of really capturing attention. And so again, I tend to be optimistic while recognizing the hard odds. But political accountability, big deal for next year.
John Myrick Thomas, Cambridge. Several years ago, the Japanese government announced that by 2030, I believe, it would be running on a hydrogen economy. South Korea has made a similar announcement. In China recently, a great deal of activity has gone on using electrical vehicles driven by fuel cells rather than by batteries. About 12 years ago, when I was in America, there was a great deal of interest in George W. Bush's presidency in the hydrogen economy. What is the situation in the United States now? How do you feel? You mentioned, Dan, that you were on the hydrogen committee of some sort. What is the situation in the U.S.?
Well, those companies are all struggling. So it's Plug Power. I mean, I know all the CEOs. And it really, we're not moving quickly there because I think the infrastructure problem. Japan is, by the way. And Jacinda Ardern, when I said she sees herself as an exporter of hydrogen, it's to Japan that she's targeting. So they are moving forward, and they're moving forward more quickly than we are. But they also have a lot of the same infrastructure problems, but they're a tinier country. As a matter of fact, they can produce a lot of hydrogen. So why can New Zealand be an exporter and they have to be an importer? It's just simply population density. But they have moved the needle in a hydrogen economy. It's not moving quickly enough as any of these things.
Well, first of all, Japan will not have a hydrogen economy in 2030. I can guarantee you that. But they are being innovative. They are, for example, moving forward with some of these ideas about hydrogen transport, not based upon hydrogen pipes, but upon liquids that you liberate, et cetera. But as a reminder, this is public. I mean, that Toyota had made the bet that they would do hybrids and they would do fuel cells, and they were not going to do batteries. And the reason was range anxiety. That their bet was very explicit that range anxiety would limit battery vehicles too much. They did not anticipate the incredible cost reduction of batteries and the continued cost reduction of batteries. And I believe range anxiety is, for a very large fraction of the population, not really an issue. Yeah, if you live in Wyoming, it's probably not a great idea, and especially when that electric platform, it would be true for a fuel cell as well in principle, but the battery vehicles, especially in urban environments, being also linked to things like new business models, like young people don't really want to own cars, like autonomous vehicles and the like. So these electric platforms are very, very interesting, and the range anxiety is largely going away. I expect that within 10 years, you will have quite good-sized pure battery vehicles with 300 miles range and not crazy costs as the battery costs go down greatly. But again, it's not going to answer all the transportation needs, and that's where other things come in. And secondly, what's very important, like battery solutions are also not going to answer other needs. They're not going to answer the needs for much of the industrial sector. They're not going to replace high process heat requirements. They're not going to replace, in my view, air travel, et cetera. Whereas hydrogen hydrogen is like the new natural gas. It's like methane without the carbon, and can serve. It's tremendously flexible across the entire economy. I think that's where the focus should be as the multi-sectoral solution going forward.
So Annie, just before we end, I just want to share one happy note with you about the environment. And I crossed paths with Kurt Vonnegut just before he died, and this always makes me incredibly happy. So when you feel a lot of anxiety about this, and I know earlier this week you had anxiety-ridden climate change speeches, he would listen to me talk about, saving the planet, and I almost remember, I have his words precisely. He said, Dan, I don't want you to worry about saving the planet anymore, because she is a wonderful and beautiful living organism with a wonderful and beautiful immunological response system. And as the irksome intruder suffocates her with CO2, she will simply eliminate us, and she's going to be just fine.
And I want to, but then I want to ask Dan, were both of you on drugs at the time?
No. Only him.